Hello and welcome to End or N-Gauge Railway. I'm Jonathan. As is evident from video number 6, I've now laid the outer loop of track. I experimented with an approach that I haven't seen mentioned before, which I'll cover in this video. First, I had to choose the radius of the curve. My track plan has the same gap between the rails on the curves as on the straights. Using a pico way gauge to visualize that gap, I was worried that it looked too close for the radii of the curves. This got me thinking. Using measurements from my rolling stock, can I calculate the minimum radius needed for the outer curve? The curves in this plan are straightforward arcs from a circle, and the short answer is yes, but I'm not going to cover the maths in this video. It took a little while to get the measurements and do the calculations, so I might make a video about it in the future in case it's interesting or useful to anyone. But I abandoned that approach because it occurred to me that I haven't necessarily laid the first loop in a perfect arc, and I'm unlikely to lay the second one perfectly either. What I actually did was take the much more normal approach of running my longest or most overhanging stock along the track, holding a pencil to the corner of it to draw an outer line and the middle of it to draw an inside line. Unfortunately, I forgot to take any photos or videos of the measuring process, so I've used an after-the-fact photo here to illustrate the point. When measuring, I only had the inner loop of track laid, but since that would have a more extreme inner overhang than the outer loop would have, using that measurement as if it were from the outer loop was guaranteed to give me enough clearance. Plus, I wanted a bit of extra margin in case of inconsistencies in laying the track, or if I get rolling stock in the future that has a bigger overhang. As with the inner loop, I cut notches in my roll of cork to allow it to bend, and left some occasional gaps for routing power cables. In video number 3, I talked about the issues that I had with laying the curves on the inner loop of track. Thank you to those who took the time to share some tips with me. It occurred to me that the sleepers in the Pico Code 55 flexitrack are actually pretty strong overall. It's this plastic that holds the rail in place against the force of the rail wanting to spring straight. I decided that rather than aligning rails using track joiners, which in my experience buckle easily, I'd have a continuous section of sleepers across the section where the rails join, and not connect the rails with any joiners there. I cut a section of sleepers off from some flexitrack and then half the width of that section from each of the sections of track that I wanted to join. I then slid them together. As advised by others, I bent the flexitrack by hand multiple times and to a tighter radius than I intended to lay, which helped it to keep its shape. To start with, I tried laying the whole curve as one piece, but the sleepers bent too easily at the join, which isn't surprising really since they're from flexitrack. I removed the joining section of sleepers, marked on the cork where I wanted it to go, and gently tapped some nails through the sleepers only. In my experience, the track can shift as it's nailed, so this is why I got all of the nails in pilot holes before setting the track in place. They then went through the cork easily before the fraught stage of getting them into the door, where they're very prone to bending. I did my best to hold them straight, but I did have to use 8 or so pins in total to get 3 in that didn't bend. I was then able to slide one curve of track in, and at this point verified that there was enough gauge clearance for my rolling stock by running 2 coaches along. I then glued the track down using copy decks. The next day, I carefully pushed the rails along to slide their other ends up to the halfway point on the curve. The rails have to be pushed with a lot of force. I'd slipped and cut myself in the past doing this on the inner loop, so I was very careful. I also kept a straight track setter in the rails near where I was pushing from to help prevent any buckling. I did the same with the other side of the curve, and I was happy with the result in terms of track alignment, but it turned out that I'd nailed the pins too far and bent the sleepers. For the curve at the other end, I tried just gluing the joining sleepers in place before adding track, but that wasn't strong enough and I had to add track pins. This time I only nailed them far enough to get a good hold in the door, then cut their heads off and filed them down so that they neither bent the sleepers nor looked obvious. This time though, the rails didn't quite align, as you can see in the close-up shot. At the time I didn't think it was too far out, so I decided to leave it. For a while it seemed okay, but when I eventually tried my 9F I could hear a relatively loud click whenever the leading wheels went over, so I'm going to have to do something about it. I think the problem is that I wasn't careful enough about exactly where the rails joined, and on this rail it's going over a gap in the sleeper webbing, so there's not much plastic there to hold the rail in place. I'm annoyed that I didn't notice this before I finished the outer loop, because I might have been able to slide the join further along. To fix it, I might need to precisely place a small nail or screw against the inside of the rail. I'll be able to hide it under ballast because the rail is deeper than the tops of the sleepers. Fitting the remaining straight pieces was easy. On most of the layout I soldered power cables to track joiners, but when sliding the joiners along the track there's a risk of breaking the cable join. By this point my soldering was much more competent, and I was able to enlarge existing gaps in flexitrack sleeper webbing to discreetly solder cables to the underside of the rails. As I've said before, I rely on the rail connectors to conduct power. I don't solder to each piece, or even most pieces, of track. I've measured voltage around the layout and there's very little drop, so the connectors are clearly good enough to go between a few sections of rail. I've also come to believe that there are quite a few myths out there about how DCC works and its wiring requirements. I've been reading the NRMA standards specifications for DCC as something that's definitive and correct. I won't go into the details in this video though, as there are still some things I'm not certain about. What I am convinced about is that you can afford to have drops of multiple volts without affecting the smooth and consistent running of one or two trains. From what I've measured, Endor has a 0.1 volt drop in some places, which I think is fine. Although, as mentioned, there's a minor fix pending, Endor's track laying is finally complete. I'm very pleased to be able to run 2 trains at a time. As I've mentioned in a couple of previous videos, the auxiliary switches on the point motors aren't operating reliably, so I need to address that before I start to think about any scenic work. That's all for now. Bye bye.